name's Lindsay, and this is Weird. Hello, Weirdos! Thank you for tuning in to this podcast of Curiosities. It's episode 11. Now, it's been brought to my attention that I've been lagging behind in thanking folks for their kind reviews. So real quick, before we launch into what is likely the saddest story I've ever heard, shout out to Villain96, McQuarterland, Orbital Harvest, Shelter Downs, Chef 30 Curry, KF, which apparently we have a Golden State Warrior fan who's listening to the show, Alex.Kingcott, Marla YYC, Lisa Law 12, and Lorena_Letitia. Thank you, everyone, for taking a few minutes to leave such kind words. It's genuinely appreciated. We begin our tale today on Christmas Eve of 1945 in the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia. The Sodder family had commenced their Christmas festivities enjoying food, family, and gifts in their two-story timber-framed home. The Second World War had ended in September, meaning that they would soon be celebrating the return of one of their sons, Joe, who was away in the army at the time. Enjoying an idyllic Christmas that evening were George and Jenny Sodder, parents to John, 23, Marion, 17, George Jr., 16, Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny, 8, Betty, 5, and Sylvia, 2. Joe, as we've said, was away in the army. Now, just a quick thing about Joe. I'd hoped to obtain more information on Joe's service. However, other than his draft registration, I wasn't able to dig up much. Whenever I encounter people in stories like this and they've served in the war, I always try and dig into that a little bit. It's not like that's a tiny detail in someone's life, and although his work in the army doesn't directly impact the narrative, I don't want to just glaze over his service either. So I contacted a veteran friend of mine, thanks Tamar, who mentioned that there was a fire in 1973 at the National Personnel Records Center in which 80% of the Army records were destroyed, which could explain why there was so little information on Joe and his service. Fire, it would seem, was no friend of the Sodders. Christmas Eve had been a flurry of activity. The eldest daughter, Marion, had come home that evening with toys for her younger siblings, which she had brought from her job at the dime store. The air was fragrant with laughter, warmth, and anticipation for the festivities that would be ensuing the following day. Around 10 p.m., as children are wont to do, they asked if they could stay up past their bedtime. George and Jenny conceded, but only on certain conditions. Maurice and Louis had to stay up with them and put the cows away and feed the chickens before retiring for the night. The eldest boys, John and George Jr., were already fast asleep. The children agreed, and Jenny took the youngest child, Sylvia, up to bed. About an hour and a half later, 12:30 a.m. or so, the phone rang. Jenny went downstairs to answer it and was met with the unfamiliar voice of a strange woman on the other end. In the background, Jenny could hear the jovial sound of laughter and tinkling glasses, and the woman requested to speak to someone that Jenny had not ever heard of. Wrong number, it would seem. After placing the receiver back in its cradle, Jenny noticed that the curtains were not drawn and the lights were still on. Very unusual for that time of night. The household routine was to close the blinds and turn out all the lights before heading to bed. Marion was asleep on the couch in the living room, so Jenny, assuming that the other kids in their excitement had forgotten such mundane tasks and gone up to their beds in the attic, quietly drew the curtains and turned off the lights. Darkness caressing the sleepy household. In the stillness of the cold night, Jenny awoke yet again to a loud thump on the roof, followed by the distinguishable sound of an object rolling off of it. By this time it was about 1 a.m., and she lay awake, alert and listening, wondering if the mystery noise would repeat itself. After hearing nothing but silence for several minutes, she drifted off to sleep, unaware that her life and the lives of her family were about to be forever changed. Jenny stirred from her sleep. What time was it? Something had woken her. What was it? Had she been dreaming? No, something was different, not right. As she slowly roused herself from her slumber, the putrid scent of charred wood and smoldering fabric tingled in her nose. Smoke. There was smoke. She hastened from her bed and followed the smell to her husband's office. The room, the fuse box, and the phone line were engulfed in flames. Wasting no time, Jenny woke her husband, who quickly retrieved John and George Jr. The family fled as the inferno advanced upon the defenseless home. Attempts to place a panicked call to the fire department were unsuccessful, presumably due to the fire ripping through the phone lines. Once safely outside, George and Jenny noticed, to their horror, that only 4 of their children stood with them, shivering in the frozen night. Marion, Sylvia, John, and George Jr. had escaped the raging blaze, but Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty were trapped inside, the staircase now entirely consumed by flames. Barefoot and frozen, George broke a window, slicing a deep gash into his arm, hoping to reach the attic where his children were trapped. Desperate to reach the top floor, they sought the assistance of a ladder, which was reliably always kept in the same spot day in and day out. On this day, however, the ladder was gone. With no way to reach the attic, George fled to the rain barrels, which had on most days been brimming with water. On this day, however, George found nothing but solid blocks of ice. He wasn't about to give up, and he sprinted to his 2 trucks that he used for his business, intending to drive them to the side of the house and climb on top of them to reach the attic window. Both vehicles had been in fine working order the previous day, but on this day, however, as George tried one truck and then the other, neither would start. Marion, in the meantime, had rushed to a neighbor's home to call the fire department, and on most days the operator would pick up and then relay the alarm to the fire chief. But on this day, however, no operator picked up and no alarm was raised. A passing motorist had also noticed the flames consuming the house and hastened to a tavern to also call the fire department. An exercise in futility, the tavern's phone was out of order. The persistent motorist made his way into Fayetteville, where he finally was able to get through to the operator. Eventually, either due to the neighbor or the motorist placing repeated calls, the firemen were alerted to the blaze. Help was on the way. Or was it? The war effort had depleted the fire department to a skeleton crew of volunteers. They didn't have a mass alert system in place and instead had to rely quite literally on playing telephone. The first fireman alerted to the emergency would then call another fireman, who would in turn call another, passing the news along like a daisy chain of urgency. To add yet another layer of complication, the fire chief had not been trained to operate the fire truck, forcing him to wait until another volunteer arrived who could transport them to the Sodder home. It wouldn't be until 8 o'clock in the morning that the fire department, only 2.5 miles away, would arrive on the scene 7 hours after the onset of the fire. George, Jenny, John, George Jr., Marion, and Sylvia stood powerlessly in the bitter cold, watching grief-stricken and helpless as their home burnt to ash. The house took a mere 45 minutes to collapse entirely, consuming everything within it: furniture, family photographs, heirlooms, children. It was a devastation unimagined, not even in their most hellish of nightmares. The fire department arrived, and in tandem with George, John, and George Jr., began the agonizing task of sifting through the ashes, searching for the remains of the children. Although such a search would normally take days or weeks, by 10 a.m., the fire chief declared that no remains of the children had been found, asserting that, despite the presence of charred remnants of appliances and furniture, the fire had completely pulverized the bodies and bones of the Sodder children. George and Jenny knew that they shouldn't tamper with the wreckage of their home, but the constant reminder of their children and how they perished so dreadfully was simply too much to shoulder. 4 days after the fire, George bulldozed the ashes, filling the ground with soil and dirt, intending to create a memorial garden of flowers in memory of Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, a living expression of their lifelong grief. The following day, on December 30th, death certificates for the 5 children were filed, and a coroner's inquest ruled that the fire was accidental due to faulty wiring. Now, if you have a bunch of unanswered questions in regards to what happened that night and in the following week, then you're not alone. George and Jenny had questions too, and the more questions they asked, the more questions arose. But first, let's back things up a bit and talk about the Sodders. George Sodder was born in 1895 in Sardinia, Italy, as Giorgio Soddu. He immigrated to the States in 1908 via Ellis Island, and he changed his name to George Sodder. He held several jobs, mostly in manual labor or transportation, but eventually he opened his own trucking business, hauling coal. Young George ventured into a shop called The Music Box, where he met the shopkeeper's daughter, Jenny Cipriani. She had immigrated from Italy as a child when she was 3 years old. The couple were married and settled into a happy life on the outskirts of Fayetteville. Fayetteville had a sizable Italian population, which created a sense of community and family. But there was also conflict. As World War II ramped up, so did divisive political views. George was outspoken in his opinions against Mussolini and his fascist government, opinions that not everyone shared. These polarizing ideas would spell trouble for the Sodders. A life insurance salesman, unsuccessful in his attempt to sell his product to George and Jenny, vengefully countered the rejection by saying, "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed. You are going to be paid for the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini." That escalated rather quickly, but that wasn't the only strange occurrence prior to the fire. That fall, a man unknown to the Sodders came to the house inquiring about employment with George's trucking business. The man, noting the fuse box, stated plainly, "This is going to cause a fire someday." Perhaps an innocuous statement, had George not just had the wiring and fuse box replaced and inspected by the power company to accommodate the new electric stove they had installed. Even after the fire, the power company stood by its claims that the electrical work in the house was completely safe. At the time, though George and Jenny noted the remarks as peculiar, they didn't take the threat seriously. But in the wake of the misfortune that had recently befallen their family, the remarks suddenly took on a much more ominous overtone. Despite George getting into multiple political debates and arguments with other members of the community, he was well respected in the area. One county magistrate insisted that the Sodders were, quote, "one of the most respected middle-class families around," end quote. Still though, with everything that had happened, every social exchange was under scrutiny. One of the Sodder boys even recalled an anonymous vehicle parked near the highway observing the Sodder children as they journeyed home from school. In the weeks following the fire, George and Jenny began to question the investigation. The ladder that George so desperately needed in his frenzy to rescue his kids was not in the place where it was always kept without fail. Instead, it was found in an embankment over 75 feet away from its usual place. If the fire had been due to faulty wiring or a faulty fuse box, why were the Christmas lights still on even as the fire began to engulf the house? Investigators managed to track down the woman from the strange call the Sodders received half hour before the fire started, but concluded that the call had genuinely been a wrong number. And then there's the phone line. The initial attempt to reach the fire department using the Sodder phone was unsuccessful, presumably due to the phone line being damaged by the fire. However, a telephone repairman examined the line and determined that it had in fact been cut, not burned. This would have required someone to climb 14 feet up a pole and reach across more than 2 feet. A risky venture, to say the least. Neighbors had seen a man stealing block and tackle from the Sodder property close to when the fire took place. The man, unidentified, confessed to the theft and to cutting the phone line, thinking that it was the power line instead. Although accounts say he was arrested and that he claimed to have nothing to do with the fire, there doesn't seem to be any official records of him anywhere, and more importantly, no explanation as to why he felt the need to cut the power in order to steal block and tackle has ever been offered. I suppose one could explain the ladder and the phone line with the mystery block and tackle man, but that doesn't explain George's trucks refusing to start or the exaggerated delay of the fire department. One theory regarding the trucks was that the engines were flooded in their haste to start the vehicles, but I don't know. That seems fairly unlikely that both would be flooded, given that George was an experienced driver and had been for decades by that point. And here's the big one for me. House fires do not destroy bones. They just don't. I don't want you to have to take my word for this, so I checked in with science to see what the deal is. An article published by Forensic Science International by Michael Bonert, Thomas Rust, and Stefan Pollack of the Institute of Forensic Medicine, University of Freiburg states, the changes occurring during cremation were watched and documented in 15 undissected bodies to be cremated. It was found that at temperatures between 670 and 810 degrees Celsius, that's 1,238 to 1,490 degrees Fahrenheit, the body showed the pugilistic attitude after about 10 minutes. After 20 minutes, the calvaria was free from any soft tissue and fissures of the tabula externa could be noticed. The body cavities became visible after approximately 30 minutes so that the organs were exposed. 40 minutes after cremation had started, the internal organs were severely shrunken and showed a net-like or sponge-like structure. After about 50 minutes, the extremities were destroyed to an extent, leaving only the torso, which broke apart after an hour to an hour and a half. The complete incineration of a human body took about 2 to 3 hours. So that alone was cause enough for me to question the ruling that the children died in the fire. But I wanted to be thorough, so I checked in with a firefighter friend of mine, thanks Jane, who said, in my opinion, a normal structure fire free of accelerant use would not generate the consistently hot temperatures required to reduce bone to ash. So there's that. And also remember, the house fire only lasted for 45 minutes. Even if temperatures reached well over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, that still wouldn't be enough time to completely destroy the bones so that absolutely no remains were left to be found. Jenny Sodder had her own misgivings about the theory that her children had perished in the fire. As mentioned, many of the household appliances were among the ruins. They were charred, but recognizable. Jenny even went so far as to conduct her own experiments on animal bones, burning them to see if they disintegrate in the way her children allegedly had. And none of them did. So finally, she spoke to a crematorium which informed her that they would burn bodies at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 hours in order to reduce the bodies to ash. Conditions much longer and hotter than that of the house fire. Now, to be fair, the search for the bones lasted only a couple of hours, and I touched on this briefly previously. Typically, a search would take days or weeks, so it's possible perhaps that the remains were overlooked. But to miss 5 skeletons seems just so unlikely. But I also don't have any idea of scale in terms of the size of the house, the proportion of the wreckage, and how the remains may have been masked or indistinguishable from the rest of the scorched ruins. And look, I don't want to shit on anyone here, but the fire chief didn't know how to drive the fucking fire truck. It took hours for the department to respond to an emergency that was happening 2.5 miles away. Again, I understand that the war effort had taken its toll on that rural department, and they had to rely on a crew of men who maybe had been willing, but not necessarily knowledgeable in firefighting, prevention, and arson. Between the fire department and the operator, it just seems like a perfect storm of fuck-ups that had fatal consequences for this poor family. Now, the fire chief did expressly tell the Sodders, do not touch the crime scene. But their grief consumed them as the fire had consumed their home, and they moved ahead, maybe prematurely, with the creation of the memorial. As the spring of 1946 approached, the Sodders kept their word and planted flowers where their home once stood. During one of their visits, an object revealed to the world as the snow melted caught little Sylvia's eye. It had a green, shell-like exterior, hard and cold. In light of Jenny's memory of hearing a mystery thing hit the roof and roll off, the object was determined to be a pineapple bomb, a type of incendiary device that would indeed set a timber house ablaze. The inconsistencies, the red flags, the questions, and the riddles were accumulating, and the Sodders were beginning to think that their children weren't dead after all. Between the absence of the remains, the strange confrontations leading up to the fire, the suspicious car lurking in the shadows, the latter water, the trucks, the phone line, the 7-hour delay on the part of the fire department. They just couldn't help thinking that this went far beyond a tragic accident. On top of all this, a bus driver who happened to be driving by the home at the time of the fire claimed that he saw people launching balls of fire at the house. And then came the sightings. A woman who had been watching the fire from the sidelines came forward, saying that she witnessed a car on the road, and as it passed by, she observed the missing children peeping out from the car windows. Another woman also came forward. She was working at a diner between Fayetteville and Charleston when she found herself serving the children breakfast. The children and some adults would later be seen getting into a car with Florida license plates. A week after the fire, a Charleston resident claimed that she saw 4 out of the 5 children in the company of 4 Italian-speaking adults at her hotel. She approached the group, but it was made clear to her that she was not a welcome addition to their apprehensive little group, and the adults spoke to the children in Italian, after which no one would speak to her. According to her statement, they checked out around midnight and departed early the following morning. George, after seeing a magazine depicting some ballet dancers in New York City, was convinced that one of them was Betty, who was 5 at the time of her disappearance. He went to New York begging the school and the parents of not Betty to see her. They, of course, declined, alarmed that a stranger in his 50s would be so obsessed with their daughter. With these new revelations, the Sodders decided to take matters into their own hands, and they hired a private detective. His name was C.C. Tinsley, and almost immediately he came back with some startling news. The insurance salesman who threatened to destroy the home and family of the Sodders had also been on the jury that had decided the fire was an accident. And it gets weirder. Whispers of remains found in the ashes began to percolate amongst the community. Fire Chief F.J. Morris, the one who couldn't drive a goddamn fire truck, had confessed to a priest that he had indeed found a human heart amongst the wreckage. Well, that's a detail worth knowing, Morris. Morris allegedly sealed the heart in a dynamite box and buried it in secrecy, as you do. The priest confirmed the rumors, and Tinsley and Sodder promptly went to Morris to confront him, because of course you would. Morris buckled under pressure and confessed, agreeing to take the men to where he had buried the heart. The heart was examined, and not only had the organ never even been close to a fire, it wasn't even human. What they found in the box was, in fact, a cow's liver. Okay, so first of all, what the fuck? Beyond being completely creepy, why the hell would a fire chief pull such an immoral and cruel stunt? Was he hoping to give the Sodders closure by leading them to believe that 5 of their children were dead? Was he somehow involved in the fire and he started the rumor about the heart with the hopes that it would throw the investigation? And if so, did he really think that a fresh cow's liver could pass for the charred remains of a human heart? Everything about that screams shady as fuck to me. Stacey Horn with the National Public Radio, she did a piece about the Sodder family for its 60th anniversary. In regards to the cow's liver, she states, Fire Chief Morris was the one who was told to take care of the remains that were found on Christmas morning. I question the judgment of the fire marshal about leaving something so important in the hands of a volunteer, but I think Morris's story about reverently burying the remains was possibly a story he made up to cover up the fact that he threw the remains away or just left them there. Then, when George Sodder asked him to show him where he buried them, Morris buried the beef liver so that there'd be something to dig up. With all the sightings, the stories, and, the cow's liver, the Sodders went to the police insisting that they reopen the investigation. They were turned down, and to the police, the case was closed. They even wrote to the FBI hoping that if local law enforcement wouldn't help them, federal law enforcement would. J. Edgar Hoover responded to their request stating, although I would like to be of service, the matter related appears to be of local character and does not come within the investigative jurisdiction of this bureau. Now, The letter didn't end there. Hoover did stipulate that if local law enforcement invited the FBI to assist them, then they would be more than happy to do so. How unfortunate then that local law enforcement had no interest whatsoever in allowing the FBI anywhere close to the Sodder case. In 1949, George, at a loss for what to do, abandoned by the police, the FBI, and the fire department, decides to excavate the site of the fire, hoping to find something, anything that would point him in the direction of his missing kids. To assist with his search, he sought the expertise of Oscar B. Hunter, a pathologist out of Washington, D.C. The excavation uncovered a number of items, all of which you would expect to find. Coins, a scorched dictionary, for example. But what they hadn't expected to find were shards of vertebrae. The pathologist rushed the vertebrae off to the Smithsonian Institute, which generated a report stating, "The human bones consist of 4 lumbar vertebrae belonging to one individual. Since the transverse recesses are fused, the age of this individual at death should have been 16 or 17 years. The top limit of age should be about 22, since the centra, which normally fuse at 23, are still unfused. On this basis, the bones show greater skeletal maturation than one would expect for a 14-year-old boy. It is, however, possible, although not probable, for a boy of 14 and a half years old to show 16 to 17-year-old maturation." The oldest Sodder child to go missing was Maurice, and he was 14 when he disappeared. Although there was a slim possibility that the vertebrae belonged to him, it was highly unlikely. Additionally, the vertebrae demonstrated no evidence that it had ever been near or in a fire. As George and Oscar continued with their excavation, no other bones were found. Thus, it was concluded that the vertebrae likely came from the supply of dirt that George had used when he bulldozed the ashes to build the memorial. Okay, I have so many questions. If the vertebrae didn't belong to the kids, who did they belong to? Logically, can't we conclude that these vertebrae came from a corpse somewhere? Perhaps another missing person? Who was it? How did they die? When did they die? Has anyone been looking for this person? Did they hate Mussolini too? Were the rest of his remains ever found? Surely, if there's vertebrae, then there has to be other parts too somewhere. Why does no one care about this person? It's like a post-war justice for Barb. Armed with the report from the Smithsonian, the Sodders attended 2 hearings at the Capitol in Charleston. Regardless of their desperate pleas for help, Governor Patterson and W.E. Burchett, who is the state police superintendent, informed the Sodders that their search was hopeless and that the case was unequivocally closed. As discouraging as this ruling was, the Sodders were not going to give up on their family. They distributed flyers and they offered a $5,000 reward for information leading to a reunion with their children. This reward was later increased to $10,000. That's roughly equivalent to $103,000 US in 2018. The FBI did become involved for a brief time from about 1950 to 52, but after pursuing several leads with no success, they too resigned themselves to hopelessness. In 1952, the family had a billboard assembled along Route 16 with photographs of all 5 children. The billboard read, "On Christmas Eve 1945, our home was set afire and 5 of our children, ages 5 through 14, kidnapped. The officials blamed defective wiring, although lights were still burning after the fire started. The official report stated that the children died in the fire, however, no bones were found in the residue, and there was no smell of burning flesh during or after the fire." What was the motive of the law officers involved? What did they have to gain by making us suffer all these years of injustice? Why did they lie and force us to accept those lies? Months trudged into years, years into decades. George would pursue every tip, every clue, every lead with desperate fervor. A tip from St. Louis claimed that Martha was at a nearby convent. Another from Florida alleged that the children were being kept with distant relatives of the Ciprianis. George and Jenny went so far as having the family in Florida prove the identities of their children to law enforcement. Theories involving the mafia, extortion, and other illegal activities surfaced, none of which went anywhere. With each tip came renewed hope, and with each journey devoid of answers came despair. It was all amounting to nothing. Can I just say, the intensity of the grief that this family must have been living through, the unanswered questions and the searching and the prolonged sense of hope, this must have been absolute hell. The current course I'm working on for school is the psychology of grief and grief counseling, so viewing the journey of the Sodders over the decades through that lens has been eye-opening on a truly heartbreaking way. It's added a new perspective and a robust layer of empathy rather than simply talking about a cold case from 1945. If you're at all interested in reading a beautiful story about how grief can be expressed in different ways, I highly recommend John Connolly's Book of Lost Things. It's whimsical and sweet, but it tackles this idea of grief, something that I think many of us tend to avoid. More than 20 years after the disappearance of her children, Jenny Sodder received a letter in the mail. The envelope was only addressed to her, and it had no return address, though it was postmarked from Kentucky. She opened the envelope and found the photo of a handsome man with dark hair and dark eyes who looked to be in his 20s. He bore a startling resemblance to Lewis. On the opposite side of the photo was scrawled a note which said, "Lewis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, ILIL, boys, A90132. Or 35. Although Lewis had been 9 when he disappeared, the resemblance between their lost son and the young man looking back at her was uncanny. George and Jenny wasted no time, and they hired a private detective who traveled to Kentucky in pursuit of this promising new lead. They never heard from the detective again. Some speculate that the detective was happy to just take their money and fuck off. Others believe something more nefarious must have happened to him. After all, this was a family willing to pay whatever amount it took to get their children back. If money were the motive, the detective could have milked them for years before he ran dry. On the other hand, if the detective was involved with something more shady, perhaps he needed to make some quick money and then disappear. We'll never know. The number on the back of the photo, 90132, matched a postal code in Palermo, Sicily, prompting suspicions that maybe Lewis had somehow found his way back to Italy. This theory, as I'm sure you will have guessed by now, led nowhere. Also, okay, unrelated to the photo, my mind keeps drifting back to Joe. He's away in the army, excited to return after surviving conditions that can only be described as hell on earth, only to be faced with another hell that would last an entire lifetime. How did he find out? Did he journey home only to find that it no longer stood? Did he find out in a telegram, a phone call? Just lots of unanswered questions that I wish I could find answers to. Unsure of how to pursue this new lead, they opted to add the photo of maybe Lewis to the billboard, afraid that if they went public with the letter and the postmark, they would somehow put maybe Lewis in harm's way. And given what happened to the PI that they hired, it's easy to understand why they would be so concerned about this. George, in an interview, stated, "Time is running out for us, but we only want to know. If they did die in the fire, we want to be convinced. Otherwise, we want to know what happened to them." A year later, in 1968, George passed away, never knowing what happened to his children. Jenny, through the decades, had become more and more withdrawn. She wore only black since the fire and quietly faded away into her grief. After George died, she built a fence around her property, adding room upon room to her house, battlements between her and the world beyond. She too passed away in 1989, after which the billboard, a constant reminder of this family's grief lasting decades, finally came down. Sylvia Sodder Paxton, the youngest of the Sodder children, still recalls the horror of that tragic night in 1945, despite her young age. She has spent her life in search of her brothers and sisters and has taken up the cause since the deaths of her parents. In 2013, Sylvia spoke to the Gazette Mail and stated, I was the last one of the kids to leave home. I experienced their grief for a long time. Sylvia's daughter, who has also spoken out about the tragedy suffered by her family, said in 2006, "She promised my grandparents she wouldn't let the story die, that she would do everything she could." A story of anguish and despair, but also the undying love and hope of a family that suffered decades of agony. Such is the story of the Sodder family. Okay, so what's weird this week is, well, it's weird. Maybe too weird. I guess you can decide, and it kind of combines two unrelated but related stories. So Latvian performance artist Arturs Berzins wanted to highlight the consequences of global food shortages, demonstrating what would happen if our sources of sustenance disappeared. It sounds like a noble cause to address, one that deserves to be underscored to be sure. However, in an effort to give his cause a platform, he decided to use cannibalism as his method of communication. A controversial video has emerged of the stunt, prompting an official police investigation. Law enforcement, like me, is unsure if the video is real or if it's a hoax. And I'm telling myself it's a hoax. I really, really want it to be a hoax. I mean, I wish I hadn't seen it. I really, really do. I actually sent a text to my husband after watching it saying, and this is verbatim, "I just watched a video and I thought I'd be okay, but I'm not okay. There's a boundary with this podcast and I think I just crossed it." So if you really want to look this up, you can, but that is entirely up to you and your discretion. The video link is not posted in the show notes. Without going into too much detail, the video shows someone in a forensic suit, mask, and gloves consensually removing chunks of flesh from two performers using a scalpel. The performers are awake, and there appears to be no anesthetic used, although I suppose this could have been applied prior to the video. Regardless, the flesh is removed, it is plopped into a frying pan, it is seasoned, it is sautéed, and then it is fed back to the two performers. Understandably, police are concerned regarding its authenticity and are investigating to find out whether or not it was real flesh that was removed and consumed. As the video began making headlines around the world, famous evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins, in a completely unrelated tweet, I might add, began singing the praises of lab-grown human meat. In a tweet from March 3rd, Dawkins said, "I've long been looking forward to this. What if human meat is grown? Could we overcome our taboo against cannibalism?" In vitro meat, also known as lab meat, is grown from the stem cells of a living animal. A survey conducted last year by the Plus One demonstrated that about 2/3 of Americans would be willing to try it, but only 1/3 would consider regularly partaking in it. And that's in vitro animal meat I'm referring to, not in vitro human meat. The co-author of the study, Maddie Wilkes, a doctoral student in psychology at the University of Queensland, Australia, stated, "I can't imagine that people who don't want to eat human meat now would suddenly feel motivated to eat human meat when produced via cellular agriculture." For many scientists, the idea of eating lab-grown human meat becomes a question of ethics. Professor for biomedical ethics at the National University of Singapore, Owen Schaefer, says, "You're going to get some people out there that will do it. The question is, should we object to that? Should we ban people from synthesizing human flesh into something consumable?" Schaefer, along with his co-author Julian Savulescu, attempted to address the ethical concerns of eating lab-grown meat in a 2000 paper published in the Journal of Applied Psychology. They concluded that they couldn't find any convincing philosophical reasons to deem the meat unethical. He does state some hypothetical concerns, however, saying, "There you could say this is a disposition towards humanity to shift from seeing people as people, and maybe this would push us more to seeing people as meat, but that shift doesn't seem particularly likely." What a time to be alive. So how about you weirdos? Would you try manufactured lab-grown human meat? Would you try lab-grown regular meat? I think I'm out on all counts, but I would love to hear your opinion. You can contact me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at TheWeirdPod. And of course, there's always the website, www.theweirdpod.com, where you can find show notes, recommendations, contact info, and more. If you liked what you heard and you'd like to hear more, please, pretty please, rate, subscribe, and review the podcast. It doesn't take long and it really helps weirdos find me. Thank you for tuning in to episode 11. We will reconvene next week for episode 12, and until then, stay weird.